Right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for braving the coming snowstorm to be here. And let me say, before I get into the substance of my talk, how much I appreciate the act of faith by Joe Bass, the head of the Heartland Institute. He had what, in my experience, is a very typical reaction by Americans when I say, hey, you know, there's a really fascinating story about Canada. And maybe you'd like me to come down and tell it. It was kind of silence. I suspect that what was going through Joe's mind was, amongst other things, some of you may remember that the New York Times held a contest a few years ago to find the world's most boring headline. Does anybody remember what the winner of that contest was? The world's most boring headline? It was Worthwhile Canadian Initiative. And the runner-up was Economist Dies, which I thought was I suspect that that Pat Buchanan, I don't know how much he speaks for mainstream America on politics, but I'm pretty sure he spoke for mainstream America in terms of its views of Canada when he described us a few years ago as Soviet Kanakistan. I think probably responding to the American prejudice that Canada is a country of extreme left-wing policies, free health care, welfare dependency, and so on. And in fact, a fellow that I admire a very great deal, a former Republican governor of Massachusetts, who was your ambassador to Canada a few years ago when he was leaving, gave a talk and he said, you know, didn't know much about Canada before I came here, but as I leave, having spent several years in Canada, I said, I finally figured out what the difference is between Canadians and Americans. He said, a Canadian is an unarmed American with health insurance. And perhaps there's some truth to that. But Joe, I really appreciate you giving me the honor of occupying the Heartland Institute platform. I'm a great admirer of the work that the Heartland Institute does, and I think it's very important for the state of Illinois, and I congratulate you for what you've achieved. I'm here to talk a little bit about not just Canada, but Canada and the United States, because I think Canada and the United States are two countries who have a lot more in common than many people understand. In particular, we have similar history and background. And Canada has, I think, in recent years, rising out of that shared history and background, has gone through some experiences which may be, I think, relevant to some problems that America is confronting today. And so let me tell you, first of all, about what I see as the similarities between Canada and the United States, and I'd like to tell you about the fiscal problems that Canada wrestled with and what lessons there are to be drawn from that. Canada and the United States are both, in my view, unique societies in the world. We are new world societies. We are societies based not on history, not on aristocracy, established social order, or anything like that. We are societies based on an idea. We are societies based on the idea that in the new world you come and are free to make of yourself what you can. I know that Americans think that this theory of American exceptionalism is that America is the only society like that. It's not true. Canada is every bit as much that kind of society. And if I were to take you back to, say, 1905, when Sir Wilfrid Laurier famously said that the 20th century would belong to Canada, he was one of our great prime ministers, was talking about why the 20th century would belong to Canada. The thing he said was, for the next 75, nay, the next 100 years, Canada is the star by which all men who love freedom and progress shall navigate. And Canada, under Laurier's leadership, for example, presided over the largest voluntary peacetime movement of people relative to our local population that anyone has ever seen in the history of the world. People flocked to Canada because it was a land of opportunity and freedom. And we not only share that commitment to individual liberty, individual freedom as the foundation stone of society. But we also adhered for a very long time to many other values that Americans would recognize as part of your heritage. Limited government, constitutionalism, the rule of law. These are things that Canadians believed in just as much as Americans, and indeed our Prime Minister in the 1950s used to travel Canada giving speeches in which he basically said, you know, the difference between Canada and the United States is that Canada is a land of rugged individualists and America is a society with a problem of welfare dependency, as indeed it was. Now, that situation began to shift very radically in the 1960s. Now, just to give you a point of comparison, as the starting point for the story I'm about to tell you, Canada and the United States at the beginning of the 60s were coming from exactly the same position as societies that had a deep commitment to limited governments, low taxes, an important role for government, but government was not the lead agency in society, if I can put it that way. That was something that belonged to the private sector and private initiative. In 1960, the United States spent 28% of its GDP every year on government. So slightly more than a quarter of all the wealth produced every year by Americans was spent on government at the federal, state, and municipal level. In Canada, Soviet Kazakhstan, does anybody know what the equivalent figure was in 1960? Any guesses?
35%.
28%. We were spending exactly the same share of GDP on government in Canada as in the United States. We had been level pegging with the Americans for over a century. Now, if that's the starting point in 1960 from a consensus on both sides of the border on some very important foundational values, let's leap forward now to 1994. America, which in the intervening years fought the Vietnam War, the war on poverty, put a man on the moon, and spends exactly the same share of GDP on publicly financed healthcare as Canada does, 7% of GDP. America has gone up to spending 38% of GDP. So it's gone from 28 to 38. It's risen 10 percentage points over a period of roughly 35 years. Anybody know what Canada's gone up to? 53%. So from a common starting point of 28% of GDP, you went up 10 percentage points, and we went up well over 20. Something fundamental changed in Canada. And it wasn't just that public spending rose, and I'll talk for a minute about what changed about public spending, but it was also that we began to move away from the commitment that we had as a society to managing our public finances responsibly and paying our own way from year to year. Because the vast expansion of the state was greater than politicians felt the public was willing to bear in terms of taxes, they simply pushed the cost of that vast expansion of the state that I described off onto future generations by law. If that's a situation that sounds like America today, that's a conclusion I will let you draw my comment. Now there are three great entitlement programs that all Western societies have, and that in my view are the chief explanation for the vast expansion of the state. Certainly in Canada, to a lesser extent in the United States, and throughout Western Europe. Those three entitlement programs are, of course, public pensions, social welfare, and public health care. The vast expansion of all those programs in Canada was perhaps the single most important explanatory factor behind the tremendous shift in the state of public finances in Canada that I've described. Now, as a result of, and I'll come back to those entitlement programs because they're a very important part of the story that I'm going to tell. But for the moment, let me just explain what happened. We, as a result of this vast expansion of the state, not fully financed by rises in taxes, we went through a 25-year-long period, basically, in which we didn't have a single balanced budget. in the federal government. We saw our public debt essentially double, so that by the middle of the 1990s, the debt in Canada, the federal government loan, was equal to 75% of GDP. We saw a long-term rise in the rate of unemployment, and indeed over most of the period that I've described, Canada's unemployment rate was normally a minimum of 2 to 4 percentage points higher than the United States on a continuing basis, in large part due to a different structure of social programs, unemployment insurance, and so on. The result was that by 1994, the Wall Street Journal was able to write in an editorial. This was written by John Fund, for those of you who know John. John wrote an editorial in the Wall Street Journal in which he said that Canada had become an honorary third world country. We were getting perilously close to the point where we would be unable to service our debt, and in fact, 1/3 of all tax revenues collected in Canada were going simply to service the interest on money that are owed. 1/3 of every dollar raised in Canada through taxation was going to service the debt. This was an unsustainable situation. And we have a great story to tell about how we fixed that. But before I tell you about what we did to fix it, I have to explain, if you'll give me a moment, I have to explain the circumstance, how Canada changed such that we were able to fix this problem, because we were in a very similar situation to what I believe is the state of affairs in the United States today. That is to say, there was no agreement within the political class that the fiscal situation that I've just described, there was no agreement that that was a problem for Canadian society. Indeed, the fastest and largest buildup of the debt that I described at the federal level actually took place under a conservative administration, so a center-right government, not a center-left government. There was a widespread belief that the deficit didn't matter, that we owed the money to ourselves. I'm sure you've heard all of the excuses in the United States, and we heard them all in Canada. And then several things happened. First of all, and this is one of the reasons why the work of Joe Bass and the Heartland Institute and the other institutes like it is so important to the health of policy making and government in the United States, as I think think tanks are important in other parts of the world. A decade was spent by the think tank community, the editorial leadership of most of the national media, business leaders, and other parts of civil society to convince the Canadian electorate that the issue of public finances, the growth in government, repeated deficit budgets, that these were not matters of technocratic management, that, after all, the average person has no conception of what it means to run a deficit of 3% or 5% or 8% of GDP. This is totally beyond their ken. What we did was we managed to change that debate from one of technocratic management of public finances to one about the moral consequences of borrowing to finance today's consumption by robbing future generations. And once we had set that issue in that kind of moral framework, people began to get serious about dealing with it. And it's also very important to understand that during the time that this effort to change the framework, to change the question about public finances and the size of the state, that some very interesting things happened politically. The very first government in Canada that actually had to come to grips with a crisis in its public finances generated by this growth of the state and repeated deficit budgets and so on was actually not the government of Ottawa. It was the government of Western province called Saskatchewan, in which the most left-wing party in Canada, the Social Democratic Party, called the New Democratic Party, came to office after 2 disastrous terms of a conservative administration that had run the public finances of the province into the ground. And this is the province that is considered to be the cradle of social democracy in Canada, also the place where our universal healthcare system was first invented. And so the party that I've described that came to power was probably had the deepest commitment to the growth of kind of social service state that I've described of any party in Canada. And they realized that public finances in Saskatchewan were unsustainable, and amongst other things, they most famously closed 50 rural hospitals in a single day. The joke at the time was that Saskatchewan was a Cree word for too many hospitals. So it was a left-wing government that first accepted in Canada that public finances were unsustainable. The next government was, again, not in Ottawa, but a conservative administration in the province next door to Saskatchewan in Alberta, and they unleashed a major program of reform to the public sector in order to bring their budget back in balance. So the third government in was the federal government in Ottawa. As I've already said, the trigger for the great reforms that were unleashed was this Wall Street Journal editorial, but that was only the capper of this long period that lasted at least a decade in which we worked so hard to change the climate of public opinion around these issues. And what happened then was a center-left administration in Ottawa brought in a program of fiscal reform which has fundamentally transformed the Canada that I described to you. Within 2 years, we had balanced the budget. Over a period of a dozen years, we took Canada from spending at its peak 53% of GDP on government. We took it down to 42%. In other words, we reduced the share of the economy devoted to government in Canada by 11 percentage points of GDP, an almost unprecedented feat in the history of Western industrialized society since the Second World War. We cut the federal debt in half. We reduced taxes to a very significant extent. I'll mention, by the way, that, for instance, the United States now has essentially a corporate income tax rate of about 39%. Within 2 years, the corporate income tax rate in Canada, combining both the federal and the provincial rate, will be 25%. So this is part of a broad-based tax reduction program, which I can tell you more about if you're interested. But I think it's much more important to get back to this question, which is, did this program of reform help? Because it's easy to talk about things like fixing public finance, balancing the budget, all that kind of stuff. But the only way you're going to get people's interest in something like that is if it's good for people. The average person is pretty unmoved by a question of whether or not the budget is balanced. But they are pretty interested in issues of bread and butter issues for people. They're interested in whether incomes are going up. They're interested in whether there are jobs for people. They're interested in whether social programs are doing a good job. And on all of these scores, I think Canada has a terrific story to tell. Let's take a few measures of what the outcome of these reforms has been. In the decade following the tabling of the first balanced budget in a generation, we ran an unbroken series of 11 balanced budgets. As I say, we reduced debt by half, but much more importantly, every year during that decade that I've described, every year we beat the G7 average in inward investment. Every year we beat the G7 average in terms of GDP growth per person. And every year in that decade, we beat the job creation record of the G7 average. And in most of those years, the vast majority of those years, we beat the US record on all of those measures as well. Not only did we enjoy that tremendous economic success, but this program was a tremendous social policy success. You know, one of the immediate questions that people say is, well, yes, but surely if you took the size of government from 53% to 42%, it must have been done on the backs of the poor. You must have punished the most vulnerable members of society in order to, because God knows that government exists only to help out the poor and the helpless.